All right, guys, welcome back to episode 6 of the Risk On podcast, the Arbitrage Andy. If you guys missed the last episode with Adam Kobasi of the Kobasi Letter, highly recommend checking it out. A lot of the predictions that we had on financial markets are actually playing out this week, particularly in regards to gold, which has hit an all-time high this week. With more geopolitical uncertainty, we have the situation in the Middle East escalating. A lot to cover today. We have a few interviews lined up in the coming weeks. Can't say for sure at this moment if it'll be next week or the week after, with a founder of a well-known watch company, as well as some influencers in the political space. A lot of content on the way today. Want to cover a lot of the news updates. I feel like I say this every week, but ton of things to cover. If you missed the Arb letter, the Substack that went out yesterday, that's a good primer to get up to speed for what's going on this week. But we're going to delve into, obviously, the hurricane that has devastated the southeastern United States. We'll talk about the Iranian ballistic missile strikes that took place yesterday. And, of course, the fallout from the vice presidential debate. We'll talk about that at the end today. My take on who won, although that should be obvious to everyone, as well as the Longshoremen strike that's taking place in ports across the United States and some of the other, call them black swan events that have taken place across the world this week. So, quick overview of financial markets. Crypto getting absolutely hammered right now. More than 500 million was liquidated in the last 24 hours. That figure may be higher now, according to market data from CoinGlass. We have Canary Capital, which is a crypto-focused investment firm that has just applied for an XRP/Ripple ETF. A lot of holders of Ripple probably disappointed by price action in the last several years, but I will hand it to them. They have some of the highest conviction that I see for tokens/projects/assets in the crypto space. So should be some promising news for them if we can manage to turn on up-only mode here in crypto. As I mentioned, gold has hit new all-time highs. Goldman Sachs has now raised their 2025 forecast for gold to $2,900 an ounce. I don't necessarily think this is a situation where you're going to be buying the top in gold. It has proven to be an asset that people are willing to put faith in. You don't necessarily need to be either pure Bitcoin, which is digital gold to many, or pure gold. You can have both. I talk about holding both. I have both. I think they're both good hedges to everything that we're seeing going on right now. I would expect gold to continue to climb along with silver in the coming months. We've seen an insane market rally in China. Short sellers, according to various reports, have lost over $7 billion as the Chinese market is ripping on this stimulus narrative. This rally primarily driven by Chinese government actions to prop up, boost the economy. People's Bank of China has recently announced there are going to be significant monetary policy adjustments. They're going to cut interest rates, and they may even introduce new stimulus measures. This comes after months and months of Chinese stocks being fairly cheap. I had talked about Alibaba at one point months ago. I still hold Alibaba, outperforming at the moment, but there's an entire basket of stocks, various indices that you can look at if you want to gain exposure. Again, with that, I'd be a little bit weary of chasing the momentum, but it is interesting to see the Chinese economy decouple from the U.S. markets. So right now, Shanghai Composite Index up about 8% this week. Shenzhen Index up nearly 11%, and the SHI-Next Index up just shy of 15.5%. Most analysts at this moment, the consensus seems to be that these measures the government has announced are a fairly significant turning point for China. Moving on to Hurricane Helene. So images prior to the Iranian strike on Israel, most commentary, most images you'd see on social media were of this devastating hurricane. Helene formed as a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico roughly around September 24th. It quickly intensified, ended up making landfall near Perry, Florida, on September 26th. And at the time, it was a Category 4 hurricane. As far as states impacted, obviously Florida, we have Georgia, both of the Carolinas, even parts of Tennessee. In Florida, Tampa Bay saw waters rise over 6 feet, major flooding. Pinellas County saw pretty widespread devastation. There were countless rescue teams that were working to save trapped individuals that were either in burning homes or trapped in flooded streets. In Georgia and the Carolinas, after that hurricane made initial landfall, it then weakened into a Category 2 hurricane, and it ended up moving inland into Georgia. A lot of individuals within the Atlanta area are still without power. The state actually experienced the highest 48-hour rainfall totals on record. There were life-threatening floods, particularly in Atlanta and Augusta, up to 15 inches of rain. As I said, a lot of individuals do not have power. Water advisories are going out to boil water for fear of contamination. But perhaps the most striking side effects of this hurricane and of this weather were felt in North Carolina, particularly in the Asheville region. So if you've seen any of these videos online, pretty much looks like a scene out of The Road, if you've ever read that book, or The Book of Eli, just purely apocalyptic. Entire homes floating down rivers, devastation. There's reports of children wandering around looking for their parents. Some pretty unsettling images of individuals trying to stay alive on their roofs, many of them drowning this week because they weren't able to be reached by rescue teams. That destruction is widespread. If you've been to Asheville, you know there's only a few roadways, highways that lead into this area. Nearly all of them have been partially destroyed or completely destroyed by this weather. This is going to take months, if not years, to rebuild. Just absolutely devastating. At the moment, the hurricane has killed more than 100 people in 6 states. I've seen new reports that indicate it might be closer to 130. Most of these victims live very far away from where this storm actually made its landfall in Florida, which is interesting. At the moment, the assessment is that this is going to have a damage toll over $100 billion. So with everything going on in the world, there are other headlines that are taking up the airwaves. They're taking up airtime on the news, on mainstream media channels. Really cannot understate, or I should say overstate, the significance of this event in these states. Just absolutely devastating. I received a text message from one of my buddies from school who knows someone that lives in the Asheville area. I'm going to read you this text message because one of the things that we talked about in our letter and that we talk about frequently is preparation, and not necessarily in sort of the original trope of, hey, I'm going to build a shipping container in my backyard like a nut job and wait for nuclear war to come. I think prepping in general nowadays gets a very bad rap. I think more people are definitely waking up to the practicality of prepping for various outcomes, whether it's supply chain issues, terrorism, weather events, you name it. There's a whole host of events and negative outcomes that you should at least think about. And we'll talk about some of the problems that people in this region are facing due to not preparing properly for these events. But this individual who lives in the Asheville area said, I joined a crew of neighbors working with chainsaws to carve a path out of our neighborhood to the highway the first day, but landslides were still blocking all roads out of our town except for one. We stuck it out for a few days until we started to hear that there were fights in gas lines and people carrying around guns and machetes, along with some gun violence. And then last night, we took that road down to get out into South Carolina. You really can't understand the capacity for chaos unless you've been in one of these events. I'm fortunate enough to not have an experience like this. If you read about typical outcomes from these events, whether it's Hurricane Katrina, whether it's this, other instances of that would invoke widespread societal unrest, it's very difficult to understand how quickly things get out of control. People start to panic, particularly if they're not prepared. Animal instinct kicks in terms of surviving. You have people that are willing to start looting, widespread instances of looting. 8 individuals were actually detained in Tennessee, believed to be illegal migrants that took advantage of the chaos. A report was put out by Tennessee law enforcement with images of these individuals. People are going to become bad actors as soon as things deteriorate. We saw it during the BLM Antifa riots. An event like this induced by weather is no different. As soon as it becomes difficult for law enforcement to have a presence in these areas, to get to people or to enforce the law, you're going to have bad actors come out. A lot of mixed takes on social media as far as the moral implications of looting or trying to find what you need to survive. But the bottom line is, when shit hits the fan, people are looking for fuel, they're looking for gas, they're looking for ways to stay warm, food, water. You might even have people that are looking to steal people's valuables, commit crimes in these instances. Really something to be aware of. And one of the major considerations if you do begin to prep in some capacity for these events. And right now in the United States and different parts of the world, I don't look at prepping as some sort of edgy, far out thing that a small segment of the population does. It's just simply pragmatic. You're being given example after example and sign after sign of the way that things might deteriorate or pan out. And for you to not take basic steps to be prepared is ignorant. It's also silly because you could find yourself in this situation. Not to say that I'm placing any blame on these individuals that live in these areas. That's not something I'd obviously do. But it just goes to show you how quickly conditions can change and how basic steps to be prepared can really help you out in those situations. Another text message that was circulating on social media was reportedly from individuals that are stationed in Fayetteville, North Carolina. These are members of the 82nd Airborne. And in this text message, the individual says, I'm in the 82nd, stationed in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We have guys in our unit with family in Western North Carolina that are trying to get to their family. Guys who are asking to put in passes to go help any way they can. They're all getting told no. Meanwhile, we got briefed that we have to be on standby in case we needed to support the Middle East. The people stuck need to know that we're trying, but our higher-ups are not allowing it. So pretty frustrating situation, especially when we look at this broader theme that I've talked about, where America is not being put first. You can have whatever opinion you want on the conflict in the Middle East, whether you're pro-Israel, whether you're pro-Palestine, or other entities within the region, entities or countries. But the recurring theme that we're seeing, and this comes after we just signed off more money, billions and billions of dollars for Israel, for Ukraine, for Taiwan, just last week. And there's been no formal press conference, no formal announcement of aid that is being sent to help these people particularly in Western North Carolina. Initially, people were saying that the government wasn't doing anything. I wouldn't go that far based on what I've seen. I will highlight there has been a substantial effort by locals, citizens that live in adjacent states to bring in supplies. Some individuals even using private helicopters and trucks to bring in supplies to help these people. That's certainly a good thing to see. I think at the end of the day, you have to give the benefit of the doubt to the American people. If they have an opportunity to help their fellow citizens, they're going to do it. But you can't ignore the political implications of this region. This is with the exception of Asheville, this is a particularly red area. If you look at the path of the storm, It moved through primarily red counties, red regions in the South. There are edgier, and I would go as far as to say these are certifiable conspiracy theories, right? We talk a lot about the fact that in the last 4 years, that term is used very loosely by the left, by the media to basically write off what ends up being facts. We saw it during COVID. We saw it during the Hunter Biden laptop story, the censorship that we've seen. It's very frequently used to just discredit things that a certain political camp or group of people don't want to be true. And a lot of those air quote, conspiracy theories have actually come true. So if you want to look at the status quo, a lot of those things end up coming true on a rolling basis. So I don't even necessarily like to use that phrase. In this instance, I will, though, because there are some people that are alluding to two core concepts. The first is weather manipulation. The short version of it is that they are speculating that this was a manifested weather event. And before you laugh at that, weather manipulation is a real thing. You can read about it on the internet. Of course, if you go through mainstream sources like Google, if you go through some of the usual suspects, you'll notice there's a pattern of calling this a conspiracy theory. But if you look at several federal websites that I'll attempt to link in the bio of this podcast, things like cloud seeding, things like manipulating atmospheric pressure are in fact real things that have been documented. I'm not going to go as far as to say that's what this was. We're getting further out on the bell curve of likelihood, in my opinion. One thing I will note, though, is the lithium discussion that is happening. So this particular region has an immense amount of reserves, potentially, of lithium in the ground. There was a deal signed, I believe it was in 2015, with a major corporation and the DoD, a $90 million deal to essentially break ground on lithium mines in this region. So there are economic implications of this region. Like I said, at the moment, I'm not really going to delve into that. I don't know enough about it to come up with any conjecture or theory on this. But I figured I'd at least mention it because if you are interested in reading about it, you can go on X, you can go on the internet. There's plenty of threads about it. Of course, you want to make sure that you're assessing the veracity of these claims, make sure they're true. I did, in fact, verify that that corporate deal did go through. I'll try to link that PDF in the bio as well. And it is interesting. I mean, I will say at the very least, this, of course, is going to have an impact on these individuals in these counties that have to vote, right? With the infrastructure gone, with this chaos happening, excuse me, it's highly unlikely that these individuals are going to have the infrastructure to vote or that they'll even be in a place physically to be able to do that. And several of these states are key swing states in this election. So something to monitor there. There are people that are taking more partisan viewpoints on this and saying, well, the lack of aid, the lack of, formal press conference suggests that these people don't matter because they're primarily white. They live in Appalachia. They're generally a population, if you look at it historically, that have been seen, a large amount of negligence from the U.S. government, from aid programs. And I do agree with some of that. I think that to some extent that is true. But at the moment, what we need to be focused on is getting these people the aid, the supplies they need, and ensuring that we're able to find all of the people that are still missing. So the Longshoremen, International Longshoremen Association, if you're unfamiliar, these are the individuals that work in the majority of U.S. ports. This week, we saw dock workers that walked out of every major port on the U.S. East and Gulf coasts. This is marking the beginning of a strike that is going to have potentially grave implications for our supply chain and our economy. This comes just weeks before the presidential election. On Tuesday, October 1st, the current labor contract with these workers expired. Some reports federal data shows that this strike is going to handle ports that are collectively handling almost $14 billion in imported goods weekly. Everywhere from New York to Miami, Baltimore, New Orleans, Houston, Savannah, Georgia. These are major, major ports that are importing goods into the United States. CoStar is reporting that equity researchers at JP Morgan have estimated that this strike, if it continues and if it is a prolonged strike, could end up costing the U.S. economy between 3.8 and 4 billion dollars a day. So think about that. So some of that could potentially be recovered if normal cargo traffic resumes, but that is a substantial amount of goods and costs that we are going to be incurring each day as a result of this strike. Many of you probably saw the video. The guy's name is escaping me right now. The leader of the Longshoremen union looked like a character out of The Departed, to be honest. This guy was in an interview essentially threatening the country, saying that he can cause extreme pain if this is prolonged, if an agreement isn't met. I haven't seen the recent figures. To me, it seems like the demands are pretty unreasonable as far as hourly wages go. And of course, you have this backdrop theme and a lot of the critics online saying that this type of work needs to be automated in order to hedge this risk. I don't necessarily disagree with that. The workers should be fairly compensated. The leader is definitely being fairly compensated. The guy's got a yacht. He's got a gold chain on in the interview. He's doing fine. Some reports show he's making over $800K a year. So this guy's doing fine. He's leveraging the power that the union has over U.S. ports at a critical and unstable time in American politics. Kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But bottom line, this could have severe ramifications. Everything from toilet paper to cars that come in to be sold on U.S. lots, household goods, different types of construction equipment. And not only could this have an impact on the availability and the pricing of those goods, but it could also, if it drags on, lead to job losses in those industries and in those sectors, which is obviously in nobody's interest at the moment. I believe it was the day of this strike or shortly after, Verizon saw a massive outage across the United States. Verizon and AT&T customers were experiencing widespread issues that were preventing them from making calls. They weren't able to send text messages or access their mobile data. Many of the users were on social media showing that their phones were in SOS mode, so effectively useless, with the exception of making emergency calls. There were a lot of different attempts to fix the issue. People were trying to reset their devices, move into more favorable areas. None of that was successful. We didn't really get a concise or clear answer from Verizon on why this happened. There were about 100,000 different complaints that were logged on Down Detector. If you guys haven't been on Down Detector, super easy site to go on and see what's down across the United States, everything from Spotify to Xbox Live to cellular networks. So if you ever have problems with this, that would be one of the places that I would go first. But a nationwide issue everywhere from California to the East Coast to Chicago. And look, I've mentioned this in Arb Letter before. I talk about black swans. I talk about major events that I see as having a high likelihood of occurring before or shortly after the election, given the stakes that we're seeing right now. We've already had 2 presidential assassination attempts. We've had a lot of events that have happened that don't really pass the smell test. One of the more recent ones was the explosion of a chlorine factory in Georgia. If you read our letter this week, I talked about that. A lot of fishy things going on with infrastructure, whether it's train derailments, factory fires, the bridge that collapsed in Baltimore. I don't think we can necessarily just look at these events and say that they're all coincidences. I think that they need to be thoroughly investigated. We need to figure out what happened, and we need to understand if potentially there is the chance that some of this is sabotage. Because if you have a basic understanding of subversion tactics, of fifth generation warfare that is being employed against the United States. We've already seen spies within local government. We have a new report that we'll touch on in a minute that alleges that vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, Tim Walz, has ties to CCP China. We have the border situation. These are all, whether they're intentional or not, and you probably know what my thoughts are on that at this time, these are phenomena that break down a country. They break down a country's unity. They break down a country's infrastructure, its systems, its cohesion, and they create a very volatile environment for politics, for people to live in, and they create confusion. Many residents in Georgia were posting videos of this chlorine fire. The smoke was brown, it was red, which indicates that it's a chemical fire. The EPA came out and told people that they didn't have anything to worry about. I would take that with a grain of salt. We look back at the event in Palestine, Ohio. A lot of ramifications to these kinds of things. And you have to keep in mind that the first goal of these agencies when something like this breaks out is to control panic, because people are going to panic. They're going to do drastic things in response to seeing these kinds of things happen. And you should bear that in mind. But point being, we have this Verizon outage. We had the CrowdStrike outage. We've had a lot of reported instances of cyber attacks, of prodding of our systems. Not only does the hurricane have drastic physical effects for the people that live in those regions, they now have to rebuild all of that infrastructure. Linemen have to come in and rebuild it. The supply chain in regards to different components for the electrical grid for maintaining power is not super resilient. And different people have put out reports on the vulnerabilities of our power grid, of different sources of power across the United States. Not only do you have a vulnerable power grid, but you also have this instance with Verizon. What happens if 90% of American cell phones do not work on the day of the election? What happens if the voting systems don't work? What happens if a major story that has implications for security or for politics breaks and the internet goes offline and no one's able to get online and get information? These are all things you need to think about. Not necessarily saying that all of this is done with malice. We don't necessarily have a clear explanation from Verizon on how or why this happened. So just something to keep in mind as we move into the election. I would characterize a cyber attack, a similar instance to what happened with Verizon. Those are things that I think are highest likelihood if we see a major black swan event before the election. I've mentioned that before. The other thing that I would note is a terror attack, some sort of violent act, some sort of outbreak. Maybe it's a false flag, maybe it's not. Something that essentially puts the public in a state of fear, makes them easier to control, like we saw with COVID. So those are two things that I would note. The other major story, aside from the vice presidential debate, we'll get into that towards the end here, was the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Iran. So yesterday, Iran launched a large-scale missile attack targeting Israel. They fired over 200 different missiles. If you are online, you can check out our social media pages. We have videos, documentation of this happening. Seems like a decent amount of these missiles got through Israeli air defense systems. They have David Sling. They have Patriot missiles. They have the Iron Dome. They have a lot of different means to take out incoming projectiles before they're able to land inside Israel. Based on the video, and of course it's hard to tell, it did seem like a significant amount of these missiles made it through. Now, whether that's because Israeli Defense Forces could tell that these were not going to land anywhere significant or because they missed them, that's hard to say. But this comes after Israel has been highly active in the region in different countries. They recently killed a Hezbollah leader in Beirut, and of course in Lebanon set off that insane pager attack targeting Hezbollah militants in the country. The United States provided a warning to Israel before this happened, which was interesting. If you're following these events in the Middle East, particularly between Israel and Iran, there's a lot of telegraphing going on. Something my old football coach used to say when we were running routes. When the quarterback telegraphs a pass, when he gives you a sign that the ball is going somewhere, that's generally when it gets picked off by defensive players. You can't telegraph your actions. There's a lot of telegraphing going on in this conflict. We saw a similar drone attack back in April. There was a lot of chatter about that before it happened. We get these constant reprisals and these statements from Iranian proxies in the region saying that they're going to attack Israel. They're going to face retribution for what they've been doing, and generally nothing happens. So in geopolitical terms, we call a lot of this saber rattling. This is puffing out your chest. This is making bold claims, saying you're going to do something, and nothing happens. So it was surprising that Iran actually followed through with this missile attack, especially in light of the fact that we knew about it before it happened. So that takes away the element of surprise entirely. And I've mentioned this on social media. I'll say it here. I'm not here to pick sides on this conflict. Broadly speaking, of course, I want to see America do well. If there is an imminent threat to Israel, that is also a threat to our interests in the Middle East, to our country, of course, I care about it in that regard. This is not our fight. If you're Israeli, if you're Jewish, of course you have the prerogative to have a different view on this. If you have family in Palestine or in different countries in the Middle East, or you're Iranian, you're of course going to have a different take as well. It's not my fight. It's not my place to say what my opinion is or who's right or who's wrong, except to the extent that it impacts me here in the United States and it impacts American citizens. So I just want to make that very clear. My only interest in this is highlighting some of the implications for us, for Israel as our ally, and for us as Americans. Israel has vowed retaliation to this strike. Nothing significant has happened yet. But the other thing I want to highlight, and I've talked about this with a bunch of people in the last 12 hours or so, Iran is in this conflict with Israel, right? Why, from the videos, the damage that Israel took from this missile barrage was fairly insignificant. There were missiles landing in parking lots, in the mountains, in hills. Apparently, one of the missiles got pretty close to Mossad headquarters. There were videos of missiles falling in what looked to be urban areas, but this didn't kill anybody. There were no casualties. Now, there are some people online saying, taking the anti-Israel approach, saying, oh, well, Iranian leadership didn't want to target civilians. That wasn't what they were doing. They were only striking military targets. But from what I can tell, nothing of significance was hit in this missile strike. It's not like Israel is crippled in their ability to launch a counterstrike. There was no significant strategic gain made from this missile strike. And so as a third-party observer, if you're Iran and you've watched what has taken place over the last 3-4 weeks with some of these Israeli operations in the Middle East, you know that it is a no-holds-barred campaign by Israel to take out critical leadership, take out proxy leaders, and weaken Iran and their proxies' presence in the Middle East. So you can take them at their word. They're going to launch effective attacks. They're going to kill people. They're going to take out leaders. And as Iran, you sort of hype up this missile launch. You send them all over, and it's like you don't hit anything. You know, if they were a serious actor, they would have striked Israeli barracks. They would have striked critical command centers or made sure that they did. They wouldn't be apologizing if some of those missiles hit civilian centers. So you almost can't even take them seriously at this point. And the crazy part is they were willing to do this knowing that the likelihood that Israel responds in a strong manner and actually does something of significance is going to happen. So I wouldn't go as far as to say this is fog of war. Maybe to some extent it is. But when we look at this, I think it pays to be critical of what is happening and to ask questions about it, because we have this risk of true escalation. There are rumors that Iran is only weeks away from completing some of their nuclear enrichment schemes. That would be a big, big risk for the region. It goes without saying, but it's almost like a play of some sorts. It's almost like you're at the playhouse where there's all this saber rattling, all this talk, all this hype, and nothing really ends up happening. Now, Iran knows that if they were to seriously damage Israel, if they were to take out high ranking military leaders, if they were to hit critical military installations, that would be seen as an act of war. And of course, Netanyahu and leaders in Israel are saying this is an act of war, but that would be actual game time, because that would involve a swift response from Israel. It would likely involve actions from U.S. military assets in the region. Based on what I've read and what I would deduce, there would be quick strikes on Iranian anti-air installations, oil facilities, military targets, and that would be what we would consider a hot conflict. That would be no holds barred airstrikes on Iran, crippling any of their ability to strike offensively in the region. That remains, in my opinion, the biggest risk. How that happens, I don't know. We're going to have to see how Israel chooses to retaliate to this missile strike. Of course, it's scary for people that live in Israel to have ballistic missiles flying overhead. I'm not downplaying that at all. Still a very serious matter. But when we look at it strategically, I'm not exactly sure what is going through Iranian leadership's head. You're essentially poking a bear with a piece of grass, and you know that the bear is going to swipe you in the face right after you do it. So I'm not sure what their long game here is. With U.S. military assets in the region, there is an element of deterrence for leadership in Iran. We'll continue to provide updates on this in the Substack live chat. The last thing I wanted to note is that prior to that missile attack, 2 Palestinian terrorists did go on a random shooting spree in Jaffa. They murdered 6 civilians. One of them had an AR-15 style rifle. One had a knife. Whether this was some sort of distraction to get Israeli resources reoriented or distracted before the missile strike, who knows? But that is likely not going to go unanswered as well in the coming days and weeks. So let's talk about the VP debate. So first off, I want to say pretty refreshing. That's at least my opinion. After we saw the Kamala Trump debate, the way I would describe it is it was fairly neutered. It was, the stakes were obviously high. Trump, you'll recall from one of my earlier episodes, I said it didn't necessarily seem like Trump was on his A game. Of course, he was outnumbered. There was heavy bias. There was, quote, fact checking. Kamala was dodging answers. She was saying things that weren't true. But I did say, from an optics standpoint, it was a, quote, win for Kamala. Not because she did anything particularly well, but because I think she met the bare minimum threshold for the media, for the left, to declare her the winner. That's still mostly my opinion in the aftermath of that debate. I know that there were some outlets that were saying that it was a landslide for Trump. I don't necessarily agree with that. But the VP debate last night was a different horse altogether. J.D. Vance mops the floor with Tim Walz. That seems to be the consensus online, with the exception of very far left-leaning platforms and individuals. But it is worth mentioning, even left-leaning outlets are saying that J.D. Vance won this debate. Politico saying J.D. Vance won the VP debate, but only on style. He did have a lot of style. He was cool and collected. I kind of understand what they're getting at from that. Of course, I disagree with them on saying that it was only on style. He demolished Tim Walz on the facts, on his framing of arguments, of conversations, his diction. He is a very talented orator, maybe even on the level of what I would say Obama was. And I've mentioned that before, too. I think Obama regardless of how you feel about him, is a very effective orator. He's a very good speech giver, a good debater. JD Vance is up there. There's people online saying this guy is a world-class debater. I agree. This guy was sharp. From an optic standpoint, he looked young, he looked sharp, collected, cool. You juxtapose this to Tim Walz. The memes were insane online. If you haven't checked them out, I highly suggest jumping on X. Tim Walz, I said on Twitter, the guy was just sweating. He was nervous. His eyes were huge. Just clearly nervous, shaken up by some of the comments and angles that JD Vance took. We have the New York Times saying Vance dominates debate performance, shows why he's Trump's running mate. One critique I had of this debate is that several major topics were not addressed. The Longshoremen strike was not brought up. The assassination attempts on Donald Trump were not brought up. These seem like major things that need to be talked about, and they weren't mentioned. Abortion was mentioned. The border situation was mentioned. Of course, Tim Walz had two major gaffes. I wouldn't necessarily say that the guy bombed the debate, but he did have two major gaffes, one of which was his statement about being in Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 in Beijing. I got to give the moderators credit. This is probably the only point that I'll give them credit on. They did press him on that. He failed to answer the question when it was presented. He ended up saying, "I'm a knucklehead at times." CBS said, "You lied about being in China during Tiananmen Square. What do you say?" Tim Walz leads off by saying, "I used to ride my bike with friends growing up." Just ridiculous shit. And of course, this guy also lied about his military record. When he was asked about that, he said his grammar is not always correct. So we're getting waffling. We're getting ridiculous justifications for lies that he said, inconsistencies in his story. One of the most surprising pieces of feedback was from Scott Jennings on CNN. I don't know where they found this guy. I haven't looked into it, but he is making a lot of people on these discussion tables at CNN likely very unhappy, but nervous to say the least. He said on the VP debate in the aftermath of it, it's pretty clear Vance outclassed Walz tonight. I mean, I was watching this and all I could think of was, man, Walz is so in over his head. I mean, can you imagine this guy sitting in the White House Situation Room with that facial expression that's like 50% sheer terror and 50% extreme bafflement? I mean, it was amazing the split screen difference between a competent Vance and a totally in over his head Walz. The answer on why he lied about his trips to China and the Tiananmen Square thing was probably the worst VP debate meltdown since Stockdale in 92. Who am I and why am I here? It was 2.5 minutes of absolute terrible. For Vance, night of redemption. All the political media has told us that Vance was a terrible pick and Walz was going to bring in all these voters. That charade is now over. Walz does not belong at this level of American politics. Vance does. Final verdict, Tim Walz wandered into the wrong bar tonight. Completely agree. And of course, as can be expected, the CNN panel pretty much shit their pants when he said that. It is refreshing to see people that are on different sides of the aisle call things like they were. Like I said, Walz didn't bomb this debate. He did have two gaffes, one in which he completely failed to answer the first question that was asked of him. The other one when he had that terrible answer on why he lied about Tiananmen Square. That may be enough to tilt it in Vance's favor. Vance, with the risk of coming off as a glazer, Vance, that was a perfect performance. There are like 3 or 4 tweaks that I would have liked to see him make. I'm not a debate expert. He himself referenced several of these things that he could have used to really twist the dagger in some of the interviews that he did right after the debate. One being the fact that Kamala Harris was not in any way, shape, or form democratically nominated or elected to be in this race. That's a huge one. He didn't necessarily twist the knife on that. He didn't bring up Walz's record in Minnesota during the BLM Antifa riots. He could have done that very easily. He didn't bring up the assassination attempts on Donald Trump and the rhetoric from the media. He did make several comments on censorship, which I thought was a good pivot. Kamala Harris, obviously completely complicit in those initiatives within the Biden administration that we now have proof of from Mark Zuckerberg, from the Twitter files, from various reports that have been put out. We know that's going on. They're censoring political opponents. They're censoring facts. They're working with big tech to censor facts and information that is not beneficial to the election. I do think Vance did a good job on that. So overall, not a lot of things he could have tweaked. From a composure standpoint, from a delivery standpoint, this guy's talented. I would not be surprised to see him run for president down the line. And I think it was a very wise decision by Trump to bring him in. A lot of people were critical of that decision early on. I think the people that have always stood by Vance are now vindicated. God forbid something happens to Trump. America is in capable hands with Vance at the helm. Trump likely knows this. I think this is going to alter Democratic strategy moving forward now that we have seen what he's capable of on a debate stage. He commanded the facts. He delivered things succinctly. He pushed back on the third grade teacher, wine mom moderators that were very subtly, but still attempting to frame this debate with bias. If you were paying attention, they were using the word allegation a lot. Whenever Vance would say something, they would come back to Walz and say, what do you make of those allegations? That's a negative word. They used it a lot. Vance absolutely smacked down the moderators when they attempted to fact check him, spoke over them. They muted his mic. He kept speaking to deliver key details in that point that he was making. So just an absolute Chad. That's the bottom line. The guy absolutely walked in and chatted it up. I said this on Twitter. That could have been a corporate interaction between a top salesman who doesn't give a shit with Walz, who is some nerdy little ops guy who's complaining about the salesman, and then you've got the moderators who are two women that work in HR that want to get rid of the salesman at all costs. That's basically what it was. It's getting to be a joke at this point how much bias there is in these moderators in the mainstream media. And the nice part about this was Vance kept it civil. I did appreciate that the two of them agreed on several points. I don't hate Walz. Let's just be very clear here. I don't hate Walz. I think Vance made a great point by saying that there is a large responsibility on Walz's hands to be able to try and defend this Kamala administration. The media try as they might, and maybe to some extent they've been successful, but they're trying to separate Kamala from the Biden administration. We don't even know where Joe Biden is. The guy was on the beach the other day. We don't know where he is when Israel is getting attacked. We almost don't even have a president right now. It's remarkable that the American people are willing to accept the fact that they've just sunsetted this guy. And now we're just like in this weird interim period where we're supposed to just like usher in Kamala and Tim Walz and not ask questions about the fact that Joe Biden is nowhere to be found. It's scary, actually, if you really think about it during a time like this. So as I said, I don't hate Walz. I don't think he absolutely bombed it. Maybe the guy's genuine, but I would say at the moment, the two major issues I have with him, aside from being what I would describe as far left through his policies and his ruling of Minnesota, particularly during BLM and Antifa riots, is his potential links to China. So Chairman James Comer, this came out earlier this week, is subpoenaing the Department of Homeland Security after a whistleblower has revealed information that Governor Walz may have ties to the CCP. We've talked about, and that was the other thing I didn't mention. JD Vance could have dogpiled on top of Walz and said, what's up with your 30 visits to China? When we talked about the lie, we got the bizarre answer from Walz, but why not ask about the 30 different visits the guy's made to China? Like that's definitely worth noting. In this James Comer report, it says, according to recently received whistleblower disclosures, we've learned of a non-classified Microsoft Teams group chat among DHS employees and additional intelligence reports that contain information regarding a long-standing connection between the CCP and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Specifically, through whistleblower disclosures, we've learned of a non-classified Microsoft Teams group chat among DHS employees titled NST NFT Biweekly Sync. That contains information about Governor Walz that is relevant to our investigation. We've also learned that further relevant information regarding Governor Walz has been memorialized in both classified and unclassified documents in control of the Department of Homeland Security. We know the Department of Homeland Security is corrupt. Everything from the border to some of their involvement in alleged precautions that were taken or investigations that are ongoing for the Trump assassination attempts. We know that Secretary Mayorkas has lied explicitly in front of Congress. These are the two major things that I have an issue with Walz. This guy might end up being the vice president of the United States in an unprecedented time of geopolitical strife, and this guy might have links to the CCP. This should be a major, major story, and it wasn't even covered in the debate. So that's all I have for you guys today. In short, I think Vance mopped up Walz in this. Unlikely to have any major impact on this election. Trump's odds at the moment are up 1% on Polymarket following that debate. We now have just 33 days to this election. Unlikely that we're going to see any more debates. We'll continue to provide updates on the election, Israel, a lot of the major stories that we covered today in the Substack live chat. We'll have a new ARB letter out tomorrow on Substack if you guys want to see some of the fresher updates for financial markets. That's all I have for today. Appreciate you guys tuning in to Risk On. Appreciate the ongoing support. We're almost at 100 reviews on Spotify, 4.8 rating. Really appreciate that support. If you enjoy the show, be sure to leave one on there. Also worth noting, you can listen on YouTube as we work to get this listed on other platforms like Apple Music. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until next time, take care.